The next speaker I would like to introduce to you is Fawzi Mesmar. Again, someone an icon of the industry. He is the head of design at DICE, EA Digital Illusions, CEAB. He is an award-winning creative director, game designer, author, public speaker. The list of his credentials is endless. He's also a retired esports player, and he's been in the gaming industry for more than 17 years. His career has spanned continents and geographies. He's traveled across the Middle East, New Zealand, Japan, Europe. He's worked everywhere. And some of the places he's been at are DICE, King, which is now part of Activision Blizzard, Gameloft, and Atlas, which is one of Sega's companies. He's worked on over 20 titles that many of you have heard of, notably games in the Battlefield franchise, Candy Crush, and the Persona franchise. How cool is that? The next speaker that we have is Dean Zhao. So Dean is the director of game investment and strategy at Perfect World Games. His career spans 20 years, and he started as an investor. Just a moment, please. So he started as an investor. He's come a long way, and some of his investments include Good Shepherd and Kowloon Knights. He's become the face of one of the leading game companies, Perfect World Games, and his keen knowledge and interest towards different demographics is very impressive. Hi everyone, welcome. The last speaker I'd like to introduce is Poornima Seetharaman. Poornima is the lead game designer at Zynga. She's been part of the industry since 2006, and she's worked on BioShock Mobile. She's worked on Jumpstart Games, GSN, Square Enix, and India Games, which later became Disney Interactive. Her passion for games eventually led her to co-found Pinaka Interactive and Namalo Entertainment. She believes in using the power of gaming to create a meaningful and impactful change in thinking, and she's worked across a vast variety of genres, from casual to premium, FPS, RPG, MMOs, everything. She's currently part of Zynga as their lead game designer, and she is a Women in Games ambassador. She was recently inducted into Women in Games Global Hall of Fame in 2020, making her the first Indian game designer to receive this honor. Welcome, panelists. I'm going to stop talking now. I'm so happy to have all of you here. And folks, for all of those in the audience, we have the discussion panel on the right side of the screen. As you have questions, please go to the Q&A and ask your questions. We will pick them and push them out to the speakers. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Shagan. So fantastic to be here virtually, and I'm delighted to be joined by kind of an amazing bunch of people who really know their stuff. And I get to see these folks talk at lots of different conferences around the world, and always insightful. So let's kick off. I mean, we've had a fantastic introduction there, but let's start putting it into context of what this panel is going to be focused on. So we're going to talk about the phrase living games, a term which I think I first heard Philip Jagex use, I forget how long ago, but the idea of a game that doesn't just kind of get launched and forgotten about, that's sustained and maintained, in fact, that can grow after the initial experience. In fact, when I thought about it, I've actually been doing this in my entire games career. I worked at an old dial-up modem-based online gaming community back in 1998. Yes, I'm that old, and there's probably people in the audience who weren't even born, well, possibly weren't even born then. But anyway, enough about how old I am. Let's start with Poornima. We obviously had a brief description of your incredible background and history and the kind of games that you've worked on, but what does living games mean to you?
To me, I think living games are like, it's like growing a tree. You start off at a bud stage, and then you're just, adding nutrients, water, whatever is needed, and you keep growing it and making those roots stronger. So metaphorically, for me, living games are something like that. And if I have an analogy with game design, before we ship a product, we are looking at game design as the Bible, as the living document that continues to keep building as we are still in production, and it's never finished. So I think that would be the equivalent for me when it comes to living games.
And I think most of the stuff, well, I don't know if it's most, but a lot of the stuff that you've worked on has been in the mobile arena. Is there something specific about mobile that makes the living experience more powerful, or is it just one aspect of one of the considerations you need to think about, which is how the platform delivers the experience? I mean, do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I think so. What happens with mobile, especially with the way we are using the technology right now, it has become much more user friendly. Anyone can pick up and play, and the penetration into markets like India and other developing countries are a whole lot more. Essentially, the coverage becomes better, and as we have seen, even with older generation, using a mouse and using the systems have become more of a hassle and a hurdle for them versus they are much frequently using their tablets and phones, and that's something they are easy to adapt to. So I think the technology, the mobile platform itself offers that advantage essentially. But there are people, a lot of people, and including like Farm One, which recently we had to wind up, but had huge followers. Same with Farmer Two. And so we still have these players who have got used to the way it works. But mobile is definitely the way to go because of just the kind of penetration we have for it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's an amazing kind of change that's happened in the industry. I'm going to kind of move over to Dean and ask Dean's view on that. You know, what does living games mean to you? And obviously, you know, with the Perfect World role that you have, there's a massive history, particularly around the MMO. And for me, I started playing MMOs back in the days when Meridian 59 was a thing, which most people in the room won't have heard of. But most people will have heard of your games as well. So what is the living part of an MMO? Why is an MMO so important to the history of living games?
Okay, so when we talk about MMO or RPG games, it's basically very dynamic in terms of the structure of the game. And so whenever I want to talk about, let's say, living as a term, I always want to touch on the terms of live ops, right? It's basically the live ops that keeps the game alive and basically keep the game there for everybody come in to have a different experience. So I would say a very key part of keeping this live op a good job or keeping the game alive is that you got to really figure out who is your MMO game's key user and core user. And these users will have a very distinctive appetite for your game. Are they the right user or they're not the right user? So you got to have enough community management so that you be identified. Okay, so these are the core users or not. And then in order to really figure out whether they're the core users or not, of course, you're going to run a bunch of tests and all that stuff. And then you're going to have all the branding campaigns to be able to attract, besides the core users in the middle, and then you're going to have other peripheral users basically crash into the server so that you can actually make a great dynamic and ecosystems of your server. So from that perspective, that's my definitions of a living game. And of course, that to live ops, maintain an ecosystem of a server for MMORPG games and has a lot of elements in there. So such as that we've got to keep feeding in additional contents. Not only that it's only a game of service as a service that everybody's come and do a bunch of PvP. You got to have a PvE content as well to keep people engaged, to people make sure that they're familiarized with all the gameplays and all the stuff. And then they migrate slowly over into the PvP side. And then you will have to make sure that you find yourself a great balance of the live ops events as well as the content contributions into the game so that you keep this game as long as possible stay alive. So that's basically my definition.
Yeah, no, I totally buy that. And I think that particularly your focus on audience and what audience want, and particularly in MMO for me, because there's always this kind of cap point where you can't just continuously provide more and more level up, progression. You've got to find other ways to engage audiences. And for me, particularly in an MMO, it's the other people playing that drives that engagement and create effectively almost content's an excuse to get people to do things together. Is that fair?
Well, I think I partially agree. Though I think MMO nowadays, you still got to fit in additional contents in there. Contents as part of a game as a service, and also as a lot of the MMO right now introduce quite a bit of a single player campaign contents that keep people coming back engaged, and then they switch over to the PvP or really the MMO or community side. So really, then you have to really have both in the MMO game to keep it engaged.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a kind of interesting kind of way of thinking at it, because if you focus on how you deliver content to create and stimulate audiences, to me, what the definition of what content looks like can change as well, because you can look at, customization, socialization, but also how you create new activities and events. And it means you end up with this rich tapestry of experiences.
Yeah.
So, Fawzi, obviously you're the kind of the other end of this this lovely kind of living games model. But you've worked in mobile, I know. But now you're in the sort of PC console world, and well, you tell us, what does living games mean to you?
So, living games basically is where we want. I think it's like the inevitable evolution of gaming from where we wanted to be when gaming first started, really, and we were just like constrained by the technicality of things. So, like if you remember, like the dawn of gaming, and people were playing arcade games, and then they'd finish the game, and they're like, "Oh, I wish there was more of that," or like, well, "My coin is still good." If there were like a bunch more levels to go and stuff like that. So there was always we were always constrained by the ability to deliver more content to the players through the means of the technology itself. So that arcade cabinet was sometimes modded by an extra circuit to add more levels. Absolutely. Or people had to wait a year until we developed the sequel so that we ship in a large machine to replace the old one. But all of this is translation to the player's needs of like, yo, I'm into this game. Can I have more of this, please? Right? And so eventually, like the technology now enabled us into skipping the part where you have to wait until the extra game is developed, put on a cartridge, then on a truck, then on a boat, then shipped to you, and then you finally pay and get it, to like you have either a device in your pocket that's capable of delivering that to you all the time, or your home console or PC is connected to the internet, and then you can get access to that immediately. So living games, to me, is what games always were supposed to be, in terms of like, I'm into this game, I'm playing it, I'm enjoying it, I would like to get a lot of new content coming over to me all the time.
Yeah, I started out with board games. I noticed that Poornima had Catan sat in the background of her room, and the thing that made those games for me so exciting was that it was all about the interaction between me and the other players. And I think what living games has allowed is a certain experience around that kind of idea, where we have this playground, we have this sort of sandbox to play in, and it's the way that we interact with other people that drives not necessarily the first play session, but the 10th, the 100th, the 1000th play session. Mm-hmm. Becomes, we become so familiar with the experience that it was so deeply involved. I remember when we were running these dial-up modem-based first-person shooters, so Counter-Strike. I like to bring up Counter-Strike because I kind of technically saved it. It's a bit of a lie, but it's also true. They ran out of money. We bought them some new computers. They got bought by Valve. But what was fascinating about Counter-Strike back in the day was just how much passion and enthusiasm there was, and how much effectively ongoing competitive training where the content was the people playing with each other, and the framework, the community around that experience. And with the games that you're working on, it feels to me you're seeing very similar, but probably taken to the next level. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. So like even you mentioned like we are more like in traditional gaming on console and PC. So but just yesterday we've launched an update for Battlefield 5 almost 2 years after release. And some of the features that we shipped to Battlefield 5 were community games in which people can have mutators to modify their games and have custom servers and new rules into how they want to play their games and engage with their users. So like even like a traditional gaming franchise in which we're still selling a box in the store sort of. It's not just the old days where you just buy the game from the store and that you get to do what you and that's the end of it. We've shipped more content to that game after the initial launch than we had originally on the disc, I imagine.
Let's get into business models and all that kind of stuff later. But I just thought, while I'm here, I should just highlight a comment that came up in the Q&A. Yash was saying that they just heard that one of the panel members worked on Battlefield, and the comment was how cool it is to work on games like that and working with other professionals. So I thought that was worth kind of mentioning. And I think it is. I don't know about you guys, but I think it is cool. All of the games that we're talking about here, the games that you've been working on, the MMOs. One of the delights about working in games is that we get to be creative in the single most popular form of digital entertainment on the planet. When 1/3 of the population of the planet play games, then I think the responsibility and the kind of opportunities that we have to be able to create sustaining and lasting experiences, which I think is what I think you were hinting at. In fact, both all of you have been hinting at this sustainability. I like this game. I want more of it. So how? Let's sort of go a little bit deeper into that. How do you deal with that flow? But how do you know what's working? How do you know what isn't working? And how do you build and sustain a game?
I think the advantage when it comes to living games, especially, is that we get the opportunity to make those mistakes. Ideally, we shouldn't, but then even if we do a mistake, it's easier for us to go back and fix it, which when you compare it with the premium games and others, it's not possible. You need to make it right the first go. And I think like the one point that you mentioned especially is that a lot of these living games are very social in nature. And especially for some of the ones that Zynga is focused on, is essentially a lot more on the social-driven aspects of it. So I think multiple things besides metrics, which our PMs are really hardly completely looking at. We also have the consumer insights and dividing the player personas in your game, understanding what is it that they need, what is it that they're coming to the game for. Because everyone has their own perspective and why they want to come to play this game. Like when Farmville 1 started, it was essentially a farm simulation game, but then people started using it for decoration purposes and customizing. And so it became like an invest and express. The expression part was more like an emergent gameplay rather than a completely purely intended one. So what happens is that with living games, you can actually see that trend. You can take it, you can adopt it, and you can make it work for you. And so what Zynga did is that picked these up and added more elements that gives you the whole idea of expression and put it together for the users to feel more. So we completely captured that particular persona, that kind of player type that is coming into our game. I think it's a perfect mix of what metrics tell you and consumer insights. And I think that determines when you start off, obviously, as a designer, it's with gut instincts, competitor analysis, and all that you're putting together. But after that, it has all got to be for the player. What does the player want? And you have your divisions of player, your early level users, you want them to engage. And then you have your elder or VIP players. You want to make sure they are happy because they are the ones paying you and keeping you sustained. So I feel like it's a pure, perfect mix of everything, and you get the ability to go back and try something new. So I think in one of the other companies that I work for us, we experimented with something which did not quite work, but then we got some extra detail from it that, when we made it interactive, it was more fun. So we tried something that completely aligned with the target audience. And what it in turn gave us was that when we tried something more experimental, they were more than happy to try it out. So it became like a give and take relationship between the user and the game developer, where they said, hey, they are doing this for us. So when we try something new, they instead of saying, oh, we don't want that, they're like, we'll give it a good shot. And then if we don't like it, we know the developers are listening to us and they're hearing us.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting kind of factor about the principle of living games. And I actually also believe in the massively single player game. I know it sounds like an oxymoron, but I know that there are certain types of game mechanics in certain areas where I don't want to be disrupted by other people. I want to know they're there, but I don't necessarily want to actually engage with anybody. There are times when you want those kind of games too. But I think it's interesting where, talking about the feedback and the data. I'm an absolute lover of data, and the more I get it, the better. But this idea of hypothesis and test and response and being able to communicate, to me, seems like the heart of what drives what living games and why they're so successful compared to others. But actually, this is all pretty normal stuff though in MMOs. I remember chatting to John Smedley years ago when I was at PlayStation. We were talking about the way that EverQuest was operated and run, and that they'd spent a lot of time managing and operating data in that kind of classic MMO. So, do you think data's always been part of the MMO scene, or is it something where you've seen innovations happen in terms of the way that games are developed, in terms of the sort of, the sphere that you guys work in? Dean.
Oh, that's a question for me. Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. No problem. I think data is a very essential part of the gaming design. So first of all, in terms of game designs, I don't believe all of a sudden nowadays, maybe it'll happen, but nowadays I think incremental innovations to the game design actually makes a lot more sense than all of a sudden you just make a leaping change to your game. And making a leaping change to your game can sometimes be very catastrophic. And so whenever you have incremental improvements of your game design, and then you will always want to bring this back to the community and test it out to see how the players are feeling it, and how the retentions and numbers are being impacted, and how exactly the level of interactions are increased, or maybe the ROAS is actually increased. All these numbers come into a combined decisions to suggest whether these incremental improvements are going to be very useful or not. Even a game is launched, you could potentially introduce some incremental change to the gameplays and all that, so that you can actually increase engagements of the users. So one of the examples, I think, for the 4X strategy is also...
Oh, we seem to have lost Dean suddenly. I'm sure he'll come back shortly. I kind of was really enjoying the direction Dean was going in there. This idea that the important role of data, but it's not just a sort of moment of time. It's not just a cutout. It's actually an incremental process. It's an adaptation. I mean, it's something really close to my heart to look at a pipeline of delivery of experiences. So, I mean, Fawzi, in terms of your context, let's focus on data with you for a second. Obviously, with a lot of the kind of premium games, that there's an awful lot of development work that goes up front. You don't have any data really until you're live. You do get some, but you're going to have scaling the availability and the confidence you have in the data is going to take time. And until you have people who don't have any emotional connection with you, how can you trust it? I mean, how does data work for you guys?
Yeah, it's a quite a different ballgame than in mobile, when the game is live and you're constantly getting the information, and you can have those small incremental deliverables that can have drastic differences, and do all of these tests. As you said, a lot of the development is upfront, and there's a bunch of stuff that we kind of have to have a leap of faith in and make sure that we go. But what we try to do is that we try to minimize the surprises as much as possible, especially when working on a long-running franchise. This can be quite, helpful.
A long-lasting and beloved, so presumably quite dangerous to change too much.
Absolutely. So we have a very passionate fan base, and they definitely keep us honest, and they let us know when we screw up, very, very politely, which is great. And we have a constant communication with our community, so we always know, we have our pulse on things, and we know when we're doing things well and we're not, and we'll be able to course correct and change. But yeah, being part of a long-running franchise means that we have tried some things, and we do those incremental changes over the course of the series, and then we gauge what was popular, what was not, and then make the changes accordingly. Plus, like, as we're going into like, modern AAA development, test environments and community test environments and like betas and open betas and stuff like that are tools that we can now rely on more to kind of like to simulate a live game as much as possible before we actually go live, so that we can get readings, make sure our tech kind of works, and we got the stuff in place in order for us to be able to service the game on a live kind of scale. So,
but as we know, it's not a guarantee that you're going to get a good reflection of what the real audience is. I imagine that the guys making Anthem spent a lot of time testing that game, but obviously it didn't do quite so well when it came out. I mean, I'm not trying to ask you to cast dispersions on you on, but my point is more that it's how we approach the capture of data and how we deal with our own biases in that, which I think is going to be, is an interesting challenge. I mean, do you have any particular kind of techniques that you use to try and avoid falling into pit traps like that?
So, like in generally in my career, there are when you can't have all the decisions made purely by gut feeling, as you can't have all the decisions being made purely by data. Data is like it's a powerful weapon in the hands of who wields it, so to say. And depending on how the message around the data can be formed, it can, like, the same kind of statistic can serve multiple opposing opinions sometimes. So,
absolutely, exactly. I mean, I like to think of it as like, data casts a light, but if you don't point in the right direction, you cast shadows as well.
Absolutely. It's not about the data itself, it's the analysis of the data that gives you the course of action of what you need to do. And that means it's basically our interpretation of the data and us aligning on how that information falls into the logic that we're applying for our designs.
Exactly. And actually, that takes me back to something Poornima was talking about earlier, the idea of like the hypothesis and test. I mean, for me, I like to break a game down into its core mechanic, the context loop, which is what I call a sort of sense of purpose and progression, the sort of the optimization, the part, so the reason why you come back and play. And then the third part for me is the bit that's not the game, the kind of socialization, the cultural zeitgeist, those kind of things. And when I'm looking at kind of the delivery of a living game, I try to build on firm foundations. So I start with the mechanic, make sure that's working before I start looking at the purpose and progression. I mean, that's my approach. But how do you guys think about this sort of structure? How do you look at using data and slicing up games to be effective?
Yeah, I think it's a very similar approach. The thing is that I believe, irrespective of the kind of game we are making, on a very iterative design model, which is essentially get your foundation strong and then start building the layers. Because, as designers, we tend to do the whole feature creep. We want everything coming in. But we don't know what is working and what is not. And it's better to do it in layers where you can just strip off one layer that's not working, but it still keeps the core strong. And so for me, everything comes down to what is the MVP, which is the minimum viable product. Irrespective of whether it's a game we are talking about or a feature or a smaller meta or anything, essentially. And for me, so I think breaking it down to, like you said, what is a core loop? How can I build further on that? Sometimes when we are adding something on top of a core mechanic, we tend to create another mechanic that may take you away from the core mechanic. And if that is engaging, then you already know you have left your core mechanic somewhere else. You're looking at a different game altogether. So whatever you're adding needs to reinstate into the core system, make it much more stronger, and work towards that. And I think layered design for me is key. And what is the end goal of it? What are we trying to solve? So before forming the hypothesis, it's essentially what's the problem statement? Does that problem truly exist? And if it does exist, then for whom? And how many of that users are there in our system? And these kind of questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I just love it when people basically quote the scientific method in game design. I know that sounds silly, but I love it because you basically just said the key thing is there a problem, and how do we solve it? To not just assume that there is a problem, but actually to test it I think is massive. And in fact, there's a question here from Suraj Raja here about if you do an ABC test and players get different experiences, what happens if they find out they've got different experiences? How do you deal with the fallout from that? I mean, I'd be interested to know if that's an experience that you've had there, Poornima.
Yeah, I don't think there's that much of a fallout. They do like even when we do ramping up of features, where just only 5% or 10% actually get the feature, much like what Fawzi was saying about closed beta and beta testing. So we do that to make sure everything is working and nothing gets broken. And even if it does, we do have these on-call issues, but it's a smaller margin for us to solve instead of breaking down for millions of users. And yes, occasionally we do get that social thing where people are talking about, hey, I got this and you didn't, I got this feature. But after a point, it kind of settles down because experience matters over everything else. So when we finally identify what is working for the majority of target audience and that gets rolled out as a proper feature, everyone is happy about it. And at some point, we are also testing it like on a very minor level that players may not necessarily capture, but internally data is actually capturing that, and we are turning those experiments on, off, and checking what is working for us and what is not. So we have not seen too much of the discrepancy of feedback coming from players about it. They're usually focused on the larger picture, and our experiments are also like our MVPs. We are running smaller, shorter, faster experiments instead of waiting for something really large to happen and complicating that. And those, especially when we are ramping larger features, it's just a rollout time. So eventually everyone gets it. So they do complain about not getting it, but I feel like that also builds up anticipation in some ways. People are more excited about it. So it does work that way for us.
So it just seems to me that what we're basically saying is it's all about how you communicate it. Having kind of clear, defined goals that you test against real data, that you allow you to see, okay, I think my insight is going to say this result's going to happen. Let's try it with these subsets of groups, but let's make sure we do it in a way which is authentic. To me, that kind of seems key. I mean, Fawzi, do you have these kind of issues when you're making kind of tests and changes, or you're making, a new battle pass or a new structure? How you deal with, people's how you identify what's the right price point, what's the right value, how do you make things meaningful without leaving a bunch of players feeling disenfranchised?
Yeah, so I think based on previous experiences in previous companies, like A/B testing a bunch of things when it comes to like making sure that tech works and the flow is kind of optimized and people's interacting with certain features are better is generally good practice. And as mentioned before, when you're testing on a small portion of the population of your game, it's like 5 to 10%, and you're checking these things there. That's unlikely to have a rolling effect on the potentially millions playing the game. But also based on those previous experiences, like A/B testing on pricing specifically is where things get a bit hairy, so to speak. And
don't know what you mean.
and it's I think it's a delicate issue for really good reason.
Yeah.
And it's like it's one of those things that we're generally advised to avoid. And especially when it comes to pricing, you got to do most of your work offline and make sure that you're presenting the value proposition that the users are hoping to get based on the pricing that you are providing. But this kind of seeing some other competitors, other companies trying to do A/B testing on pricing almost always results in a negative reaction.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult, particularly when you've got regional value perceptions as well. And I think it'd be interesting to sort of see what you think in terms of, obviously, the domestic kind of spending power in India might be different from in China, might be different than in the US. And how much does that regional element affect your decision-making process, not just for pricing, but generally?
I think it's like unfortunately, like when it comes to games, like usually the answer to a lot of these questions starts with "it depends."
Of course.
And the it depends part like relies on many things, from the size of the game to the size of those incremental changes that you want to are these markets part of your target, like your core target? How much of the investments are you putting into those core markets, for example, to be able to customize the deliverable for it? So in an ideal world, so let's take Utopia, when you like have infinite time, infinite resources, and infinite people. The best experience would be for you to really culturalize or regionalize the experience depending on the regions.
Almost individualized from your description. If you have unlimited time and resources, then
Exactly, yeah.
you specifically.
If we're talking Utopia here,
Yeah.
I'll make sure that Oscar's character in the game gets that hat.
Yeah. There are quite a few games that have deliberately put my hat in, I'm glad to say.
That would not surprise me. I think it's very characteristic. But we always have to face the realities of our budget, development timeline, and return of investments on our games, and where we're releasing these games. So if I'm making a game that is targeting the MENA region, then it would make sense for it to have Arabic support. The UI is right to left, and I've taken all of these things into consideration, including the pricing.
Yeah, exactly.
But if it's not my target, it's not my my main market, and I'm actually making a game for the Korean market. Let's say it will be a distraction for me to focus on two things at the same time. So.
No, exactly, and I think it's really interesting because there's some. I think last year's Pocket Gamer in Jordan, I did some work with one of the guys from Playthrough Arabia, where we did some analysis on I think it was on PUBG Mobile. Turns out Saudi Arabia is the second largest source of revenue for PUBG Mobile, which is astounding when you think they basically were generating something like 5 times the spend per head of population in Saudi Arabia than the US, which was the largest. So it just shows you that if you understand the culture and you understand the localization, it can have dramatically important effects. But equally, you've got to justify that against the rest of what you've got to deliver as a game, because actually having the manpower to deliver good experience for as many people as possible. And what if it taps into Poornima, you were talking about the MVP, the minimum viable product, which I think a lot of people don't get. But I think there's also kind of like a sustainable profile for a game in terms of how operationally you can deliver it. Do you think that's true, or is there kind of different ways of looking at that?
I think there are a few ways. So, few of this, what Fawzi was saying, is depends on what market you're targeting and what your ROI is, and that also depends. Now, for instance, Match 3 continues to be a game that everyone is still going for, but the CPI, your cost per installs, are pretty high on that. And if you are an indie who doesn't have that kind of user acquisition budget, then is that really the game you want to go for, because you're competing against the giants? So then it really depends on what is it that you're targeting, what your budget is like, and what is your prime area of focus. And today, thankfully, we have a market that can take care of hyper casuals, your free to plays, your premiums, your indie titles, and AAAs, everything. There are consumers for all of it, and even for your VRs and ARs and cloud gaming. So it's brilliant. And even if I talk about Zynga Poker, for instance, started in 2007, it's still going strong for a game that's that old. And because it's what they have done is captured what is essential and what is the essence of the game itself, and made sure they are just continuing to build on that and making it work for them. So every new thing that's being added is also an MVP that's going back to it. So I think it's always just going back to basics. And I think we were just having this discussion backstage where it's often misconstrued that designing for a particular kind of game is very different from another. But if you break it down to the principles and fundamentals, it's not. They follow the same process. You need to have your positive feedback loop. You need to make sure it is controlled so that you don't give away too much. so that it's not going to make the people or the players feel overwhelmed and that they don't see the novelty in it anymore. So the pacing of rewards, your risk versus reward, how you manage economy internally. So actually, if you think about most of your RPGs or even FPS, there is an internal economy. The most of the times when you talk about economy, we are considering equating it against monetization only. But there is actually a lot of internal economy that's happening across different games. So it just comes down to you understanding how this economy factors to your game design and why do you need to push it, and that's how you're going to make your difficulty, your progress, and all of this, because these are all essentially your psychological factors that let you continue or return to these games. And I feel like these are fundamental. So for me, these are my building blocks, no matter the kind of games I plan to design.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, we've got so many areas I want to. I wanted to talk about monetization. There's some questions here which I think are great. For example, what do you actually do with something like poker because the rules are fixed? But I think given the limited time we've got, I'd just like to let's start with you, Fawzi. What?
Okay, and when you logged in the first time, programs up.
Sorry, what was that?
We were with him when that process was there.
I'm not too sure who that was speaking, so I'll carry on. So Fawzi, let's look at the end game here. So, can living games last forever, or do you? I know the answer is going to be it depends. By the way, can living games last forever?
You know me too well, Oscar.
I know. But at what point do you turn around and say it's time to end? And also, can you still grow a game, or does it get to the point where the game is just going to inevitably decline? I mean, so what is the life cycle of a game look like? Is there a point where you just say that's it, done, kill it? What do you think?
So the first part of your question, can a game live on forever? Potentially. Like we have in this industry a lot of examples of games that have been running for quite some time. Like we're just talking about Texas Zynga poker. I'm still calling it Texas Hold'em from back in the day on Facebook. Like it's
I'm thinking RuneScape. RuneScape's over 20 years.
RuneScape, World of Warcraft, the Travian. I think that company is still producing content for that game as well. So like there are examples. League of Legends. There are examples of games that have been running for over a decade at this point, and they're still going on strong, and there's no signs of slowing down. So like even so a franchise I worked on, I worked on the Candy Crush franchise at some point in my career. And a huge game, obviously. And at some point, I think around 2017, the game actually grew. Yeah. So, that answers the second part of your question. So, that game was always big, but, as with most games, it starts to dwindle down a little bit, and then it just grew back up again. So, also still very strong. I think games in that franchise have been consistently in the top grossing chart since 2012. There have been at least one or two Candy Crush games in the top 10 grossing charts around the world. It's closing into now 8 to 9 years. So I think it is definitely possible. It requires, first of all, a core product that is just good. That gets the ball rolling, and then an equally good team that is successful at maintaining the live and fresh feeling of that product to kind of keep players engaged and have that be part of their lifestyle.
Yeah, it makes sense. So, what about for you, Poornima? This idea of can a game last forever? That principle. I mean, obviously, you've mentioned Zynga Poker. If you think about it, it's probably worth putting into context Zynga Poker, because 2007 is when Facebook opened up to social games. And I think when you think about that, when people talk about social games being kind of a historical thing that doesn't exist anymore, it still does. And now it's on mobile too. And so I'd be interested to know, those kind of transitions between platform and to sort of experience, and how that affects the longevity of a game like that.
Yeah, I think it helps. For me, actually, again, I'll go back to having a real life metaphor for living games and continuing it. It's like being in a relationship, and I would say, like, there are a few bunch of people who are going to give it their all, find the spark again and again, and continue extending the relationship. And then there are a few who would want to say, this is it for me and I'm going to move on. And that kind of is similar to our player types and how we approach these games as well. And it's like, making sure everything is working, making sure you're doing the minimum that is needed to keep your relationship alive, and sometimes adding more elements to it to make it feel better. And that's what we do with living games. So technically, I think, so when we moved from, say, a web to a mobile, we actually increase the longevity of the game because now it is more sustainable and it will continue, and we don't have to shut something else down. And I feel like moving that technology definitely helps. And today, I think we have engines that support cross-platform compatibility, making our lives a lot more easier, which was not the same case like a few years ago where we had to make these ports separately. And so for me, I think it's like adding nutrients. You need to know what proportions to add. When you're growing something, like you sometimes overwater it, that's not good. Too much nutrients, too much pesticide, that's not good. You need to know the perfect balance to keep them sustained. And you need to know how to fix that. If somewhere you manage to put it a little bit more, then how do we roll it back? One thing I also see that sometimes when a game is tending to end or decline, people just, push towards the monetization aspects of it and just try to grab as much fruits as possible out of it and park it because we know it's ending. I feel like as much as your paying users are there as important they are, so are your non-paying users.
Poornima?
Yeah.
I am so sorry to interrupt everyone. Currently, we are not able to get back Dean Zhao for the rest of the panel. And unfortunately, we also are short on time right now. So I am going to request the moderator, Oscar, to go ahead and start taking up Q&A questions.
I'm already doing that, actually, Jay. So you've probably noticed I've been talking to move that through. So, just to continue where you're going, I'll be interested to sort of one of the things I think is really interesting about what you're saying, I think also ties into a question that was raised earlier. Which was about, I've lost the place now. It was about when you make a change, how and people leave, how you engage them. I think actually there's a more fundamental question, which is that games seem to take on their own life, and the audiences take that further forward. But I think it's an important thing to think about how we also re-engage audiences which have lapsed, whether they've lapsed through an issue with the game or whether they've lapsed simply because their lifestyle changed. How do you feel about the kind of like sustaining and re-engaging of players?
So we do have that actually. Yeah, and we tend to do that, especially with early users. With the pandemic, we actually had a lot of inflow of new users coming in. And ideally, the game itself is more focused on the mid and late players, but not necessarily on the early levels, because that's something it's all done and dusted sort of a thing. But when we see that inflow coming in, we need to make sure their experience is best, because we need them to engage into the game, to be one of the elder players. So I think for us, it's essentially just we try something new to improve the experience. Ramping is great for us. We take it in smaller portions so that the failure doesn't hit us very hard. And these are smaller steps that we take to make sure that we mitigate that kind of bad blood that comes from players and keep them engaged throughout.
Absolutely. And again, with the interest of time, we're going to have to sort of come to a sort of conclusion pretty quickly. So, I'm going to start by Fawzi. What I'm after is kind of if you can share with people what you think are the kind of most important things to take away from living games. And there was a particular piece here that was asked in terms of the game economy. And we're asking kind of, particularly in your case, where you've got pay up front and you've got battle passes and various other kind of business models, is there what's the one piece of advice you'd give to a designer looking at taking the game into a living experience, and how you'd get them to think about business models?
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, if you're looking at the business model, the type of game that you're building defines a lot the kind of business model that you want to associate with that game. And the type of game and the business model really associate a lot with how the users are interacting or engaging with that game. So at the end of the day, at the selling of any product, it's about what is the value proposition that you're offering for that user from that product, and then what is the best and the most ideal way to deliver value through the business model of that game. So if the value proposition is that there is a whole chunk of content that you need to have in advance to start playing the game, that requires a lot of development to do pre-hand, then perhaps a premium model with like monetization coming in afterwards is the way to go. If your game is and the engagement market around it is proprietary around making a game a daily habit or a monthly habit, or something that you engage with regularly, so that you can get more out of the gameplay experience itself, then a battle pass could be something you consider. I'm starting to keep going back to you with the it depends answers, Oscar, but
But isn't that the point, though? It's like, actually, it does depend. I mean, for me, well, actually, I'm going to ask Poornima, actually, because it's more important. We're about to finish. So, Poornima, I'm going to leave you the last word. There's so many more. I'm going to get a chance to talk later. So, Poornima, what is the one piece of advice that you would give people, particularly about the sustainability of a living game?
I would say make sure your core is strong. Without that, no matter whatever frills you're adding on top of it, it's not going to work. So don't focus on the meta, focus on the base. And once you have the base strong, your metas will work well around it. And when you're adding something new, make sure it ties back to your core. We don't want those kind of feature or economic creeps that's happening, and we keep pushing new things to fix something else. Like the whole Band-Aid effect shouldn't happen. We need to have everything more streamlined and utilize your audience. You have your VIP members, you have your people who really want to be part of this. Utilize them to understand your consumers and know what they want and how they feel and how it works. I think, that would be my advice.
Yeah, I think that's great stuff. I mean, the bottom line for me is that the point about living games is that we are trying to find the things that our players love and double down on them to sustain their engagement over the long term. That's about passion. That's about love for the game. And I think that's the one thing that we have to do as game developers, is to double down on our love for our game, but through the eyes of our audience. And if we can succeed at that, and we can find the best value points, we can build a return on investment that allows us to keep investing in the game that they love. And the best thing about living games for me is that if it's done authentically, we can make profitable businesses that actually deliver better experiences for players. And at the end of the day, that's what I think players want, is they want better experiences. And it only happens if people listen to what they want and actually pay attention to that in a way that only a game designer can do. It's really sad that we lost Dean halfway through. I was so many things that I'd like to ask him, and frankly, as you can probably tell, we could have carried on talking for about another 2 hours, and hopefully we get to do that again at some point in person. Poornima, Fawzi, always a pleasure seeing you guys, and I will hand over to the organisers. Thank you very much for having us, and thank you all for the questions you asked us. I tried to weave them into the conversation. Hopefully that all covered everything.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.